My name is DJ Lim, a Director of Financial Analysis with property firm JLL, and I'm also volunteer as co-chair for the UWA Young Alumni Network. We would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. The Whadjuk Noongar remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. As a fellow member of the UWA Young Alumni, I would like to welcome you to this event. The second of the Winter Wealth series is tailored specifically for young alumni. Tonight, we will be focused on how to protect and grow your wealth and health, including a peek at investment types, insurance, and estate planning. UWA Young Alumni are part of a vibrant community of like-minded peers, and there is an array of events and ways to stay involved that you are invited to be a part of. You can like us on Facebook or join us on LinkedIn to stay connected. You might notice there's a camera filming this event. It is so that the wider young alumni audience can watch it from wherever they are. Thank you to all our event partners tonight, UniSuper and of course the University Club for making these events possible. We've also put together a networking opportunity to end this great event with some refreshments and a chance for you to connect with your fellow young alumni, so be sure to stay behind after this event. Thank you again for coming along this evening, and we're sure you'll walk away happy, healthy, wealthy, and we look forward to seeing you at the final event in this winter series. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rudy Leong, a fellow UWA alumni and private client advisor at UniSuper, to get the learning started.
Thanks, DJ. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Happy, Healthy, Wealthy, which is the second of our 3 Winter Wealth Series seminars. So it's really good to see some familiar faces in the audience tonight, and also welcome to those who are attending for the first time. As DJ has kindly introduced, my name's Rudy Leong, and I'm a private client advisor at UniSuper. Now, before I begin, I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So here's our agenda for this evening's session. We'll start by discussing some fundamental concepts when it comes to investing, and also address some of the most commonly used investment structures. Next, we'll talk about the importance of protecting your financial well-being and why it's crucial that everyone should have a plan B for when things don't go according to plan. This then leads us on to the topic of estate planning, where we'll discuss some noteworthy areas to also consider. Lastly, we'll have some time at the end for any questions you might have. So when talking about investment basics, one of the most important factors to consider, or places to begin, is with the investor and what their situation is. So we need to look at what the reasons or purpose for wanting to invest are. Everyone has a different life plan, different goals, different objectives, priorities, and dreams. And we all work extremely hard for our money, so when making investment decisions, it's imperative that the investment is also right for us. So for our goals and priorities, and also that we can sleep at night and not having to worry about the investment and how it's performing. So on this slide, we've noted 3 important investment objectives to consider when it comes to investing. So the first one is around capital preservation and time. How long do we expect to invest our funds for? Or in other words, what's the current investment time frame which is available to us? So some of us may currently be saving for, let's say, a home deposit. And commonly enough, a consideration may be to want to invest the money in order to have a larger deposit when it actually comes to purchasing the house. Generally speaking, if this is the case, you'd want to consider when you actually plan on purchasing a home in determining whether or not it's actually appropriate to invest in, say, shares or managed funds versus keeping it in something like a high interest cash savings account. If you planned on purchasing a house within the next year or so, it may make more sense to opt for more capital secure investments, so something like a cash savings account or even a term deposit. Whereas if you had a longer time frame available to you, let's say 5 years or 7 years, let's say you're still living comfortably at home with your folks and you want to save as big as a deposit as you can, you might then start to consider potentially focusing on more growth focused investment options. So the next consideration when it comes to investing is to think about risk and return. You know, so often I get people who say to me, I'd like my investment to achieve the highest return possible. Oh, and also I don't want any risk taken. I don't want to risk any of my capital. To which my response is normally to them, look, I'm a financial advisor, I'm not a magician. When it comes to risk and return, there's a direct correlation that normally exists. So this means the higher the return that you're trying to achieve, generally the higher the risk will be and the higher the chance you may actually lose capital. So we'll talk more about risk and return shortly on the next slide. Now, the last consideration when talking about investments is to consider one's own values and beliefs. So taking into account various environmental, social and governance factors, or ESG for short, when making investment decisions can be a good way to ensure that your own individual preferences aligns with your choice to invest, and it's not always solely focused on getting a return on your investment. Generally speaking, there are two main approaches for ESG investing. The first one we can call a negative screen, in which you may wish to exclude or avoid investing in any companies that trade in areas that generally have a detrimental impact on society. So, for example, things like tobacco and alcohol, weapons, coal, fossil fuels, etc. The other approach to ESG investing is called a positive screen, whereby you may actively go and look for investments or invest in companies which provide a positive impact to society, such as investing in sustainable or green options, for example. So on a side note, if this is actually an area that's important to you, particularly for your retirement savings, many super funds, including UniSuper, they do have sustainably focused investment options nowadays, which you could consider, especially if you're wanting to make, I guess, more of a positive impact for future generations. So back to talking about risk and return. Now, in the context of investments, different asset classes will offer different return characteristics and have different levels of risk associated with them. So an investment such as a bank term deposit will have an agreed upon investment return or interest rate, which is set at the time that you actually make the initial investment. Now, this can generally be considered a relatively low risk investment in that your capital is stable and secure and returns are guaranteed. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, an investment such as a portfolio of shares will move both up and down with market fluctuations, and obviously returns can't be guaranteed. Investing in assets such as shares or property can be considered a relatively higher risk investment, comparatively speaking. During times of market volatility and downturns, caused by events such as the GFC, coronavirus pandemic, or more recently the war in Ukraine, there may be some years where an investor will experience negative returns. However, over the longer term, these types of asset classes should typically provide higher returns and growth when compared to more defensive investments. So lastly, as we talked about before, when deciding on an appropriate investment strategy, it's always important to consider your time frame for investment, as this will influence what level of risk is appropriate. So for example, most of us in the room might choose to adopt a higher level of risk or a growth-focused approach when it comes to how we invest our superannuation funds. Given that the average time frame of being able to access super is probably around 30 years at the earliest. So what I mean by that is, for most of us in the room, the earliest age that you can access super is probably going to be 60, which is your preservation age, and therefore there's a pretty long-term investment time horizon. So this long-term horizon therefore allows us to adopt a potentially higher level of risk, even if some of us may naturally or inherently prefer to be, more conservative. So on the topic of superannuation, something interesting to note is that for a lot of us, super is how most Australians will start their investment portfolios, sometimes even without realising it. So as you work, the super contributions made by your employer are invested and will start to grow and earn a return, thus commencing your journey of building wealth for your eventual retirement. So for most people, super is generally their second biggest asset after the family home. Also, given the compulsory employer superannuation guarantee contribution, or SG for short, which has recently risen to 10.5% of your salary, super is a very effective means of, long-term wealth accumulation via what is effectively forced savings. On the other hand, investing outside of super requires a certain level of discipline to be able to firstly save or put away funds to actually invest in the first place. So on this slide, we've illustrated some of the features and important considerations when deciding whether to invest money both inside and outside of super. So firstly, with inside super, some of the features. So money is automatically saved in the form of compulsory employer contributions. You might also choose to make member or voluntary contributions in order to try and save at a faster rate. And this can often be in the form of, let's say, a regular salary sacrifice arrangement, which can also provide additional tax benefits by reducing personal income tax. Now, within super, any earnings, so any income or any capital growth that your investment makes is also concessionally taxed at up to a rate of 15%. So this is one of the main attractions of superannuation, is being able to save for your retirement in a concessionally taxed environment, especially compared to your personal marginal tax rates, which can be as much as 47%, depending on your taxable income. Now, once the money is within the superannuation environment, where you invest these funds is completely up to you. So you can select from a variety of asset classes and you can mix and match as well. It's often a common misunderstanding or misconception when it comes to super. People often think of super as being a risky investment that just goes up and down with the market. However, super itself is merely an investment vehicle or a trust structure that has a different set of tax rules applicable. So within super, you can choose to invest in anything from low risk, medium risk, or high risk. That's completely up to you and what you feel is appropriate for your situation. So super can also have certain estate planning benefits and is able to be directed to your dependents or your legal personal representative without the need to actually go through the estate as well. In terms of the main drawbacks of super, so money invested within super, as you probably know, is generally locked away or preserved and unable to be accessed until you're able to satisfy a condition of release, which is prescribed by the government. So these conditions of release are generally centred around reaching a certain age, which I mentioned before is called your preservation age. For most of us will be age 60, and ceasing an employment arrangement. Now, outside super, talking about investing outside super, earnings and any assessable capital gains tax are taxed at personal marginal tax rates, which again, as I said, can be up to 47% depending on your income. Unlike super, there's generally no pre-tax incentives or tax benefits, and very few government contribution incentives for actually saving and investing outside of super as well. The main advantages when compared to super is that there are generally no limits on how much you can contribute or save, and you're also able to access funds at any point in time, unless, of course, the product that you've actually chosen to invest in limits access. So, for example, a term deposit will have a particular maturity date, which won't allow you to access the funds until after that date. Lastly, in terms of estate planning, any investment proceeds when you invest outside of super generally must go through the estate and be divided up as per what your will states. So next, when talking about investing, asset diversification is also imperative. So in this case, the old adage applies, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Now, there's generally not one type of security, asset class, or investment manager that will provide the best performance over all time periods. So therefore, a range or selection of investments can assist to reduce the risk at each of the investments within a portfolio experiencing drops in performance at the same time. So diversification can be implemented in three distinct ways, which we've got up on this slide. So the first one being across asset classes. Now, the major asset classes perform differently under different market conditions. So by investing across a variety of asset classes, you may be able to reduce the volatility of your overall portfolio return. Of course, in doing so, you might also decrease the return on your investment at the same time because you are essentially averaging across the different asset classes. The second way to achieve diversification is across markets and regions. So spreading your exposure within each asset class across a wide range of countries, currencies, industries, and stocks can ensure that your investment is not narrowly concentrated in a particular region or industry. So this reduces the impact if that region or industry experiences a downturn. And lastly, in terms of diversification and how it can be achieved, across investment management styles. So different investment management styles tend to excel under varying economic and market conditions, and therefore by combining a range of investment managers with complementary investment styles, you may be able to neutralise the bias to any one style in each asset class. So here we have a case study just to try and demonstrate the significant impact that small contributions over a long period of time can have, all by harnessing the effects of compounding. So meet Sue and Harry. Both of them are currently 60 years old, and they've both been regularly topping up their super with extra after-tax contributions. Now, in Sue's case, she's invested $2,000 each year, which equates to less than $40 a week, and she's began making contributions when she was 25. So she was pretty proactive when it comes to, focusing on retirement. So over this time frame, she's invested a total of $70,000. Now, in Harry's situation, he's invested a little bit more than Sue. So he's invested $5,000 each year. However, he was not as proactive as Sue, and he only began making contributions when he reached 39. So over the time that he's been contributing in this example, he's invested a total of $105,000. Now, when comparing the two, you can see that Sue's invested less, but she's in fact ended up with more. So in fact, she's ended up with around $125,000 more than Harry. So why is this? The main reason for this is that Sue had more time. Her head start basically means that her money has had more time to benefit from the effects of compounding. Compounding makes money grow at a faster rate due to the fact that over time, the earnings from your investment also begin to accrue or earn a return themselves. So it's basically earnings on earnings, and that's essentially why Sue, who's invested less but has had the benefit of time, ends up with more. So the graph demonstrates that the earlier those contributions start, the better the outcome at retirement. But it is also important to note that obviously it's never too late to start as well. Now, this case study talks about investing within the super environment. One thing to remember, as I mentioned before, is that once contributions are made to super, you can't access these funds until you meet a condition of release, and that generally means that you can't access your super until you retire or satisfy another condition of release. So just to recap on some of the main points we've discussed so far. So when investing, you should firstly consider your objectives or purpose for the investment. Secondly, it's good to understand the risk-return trade-off, which is important. And one should also consider their own approach to risk. Next, we talked about some of the differences between investing both in and outside of super. We've then discussed the importance of diversification, or as the saying goes, not putting all your eggs in one basket. And then lastly, we ran through a case study which shows the effects of compound interest and why it can be a good idea to start early when it comes to investing. So now I'd like to go through some typical tax structures and the various pros and cons of each. Now, it's important to remember that the most appropriate vehicle for an individual may change over time as their own circumstances change. So therefore, reviewing investment structures should not be a set and forget exercise. Typically, as part of a wealth accumulation strategy, the appropriate tax structure will be considered first, and from there, an appropriate investment style and investment allocation will follow on from this. So we consider various factors from a structural point of view to determine what option is most appropriate. Now, it's also important to incorporate an individual's family situation. So for example, whether you have a spouse or adult children, for example, in order to make the most effective use of someone's situation. Now, some of the factors will ultimately include, so when choosing a tax structure, the things to consider. Firstly, the tax rate applicable. Secondly, the cost of arranging affairs along with, I guess, the complexity of the structures used. Thirdly is accessibility. So what I mean by that is whether you can actually access the funds. And the last one is also flexibility. Now, when investing in an individual's name, which is in itself a tax structure, marginal tax rates apply depending on the level of taxable income generated by that person. Investing in your own personal name is often the simplest approach. However, it can become less tax effective, particularly for individuals on higher incomes. Now, often a common and pretty simple solution, especially for couples, where there may be a working and a non-working spouse, could be to invest in the non-working spouse's name so that they can take advantage of their tax-free threshold. The second tax structure we have up there is trusts, so things like family trusts and discretionary trusts. Now, trusts can be a tax-effective structure as they allow for distribution of both income and capital gains across several beneficiaries. Similarly, companies, which we have up there, provide tax effectiveness by effectively capping the tax payable at a rate of up to 25%. However, both these structures can add additional complexity as well as the initial setup costs and the ongoing cost of these structures should also be considered when deciding on the appropriateness of using these particular investment vehicles. So we talked about super a little bit earlier. Super is one of, if not the most tax-effective investment vehicle that can be used to save for one's own retirement. Within super, earnings tax are capped at up to 15% within the accumulation phase of super. So whilst you're working and contributing to super, you only ever pay tax at up to 15%. And then once you've retired, basically superannuation, when you shift into the pension phase of super, can allow an individual to be in a completely tax-free environment on both the income that you actually draw from it as well as investment earnings. However, as we've said earlier, one of the main drawbacks of super is the issue of accessibility and other work-related conditions being met. So therefore, it's important to consider an appropriate balance between contributing to super for its tax effectiveness, together with the need to actually access these funds, either in the short to medium term. The last structure that we've got up there are insurance bonds, or also known as investment bonds. And these can be a tax-effective structure for, I guess, longer-term investing, because earnings within these structures are taxed at the corporate or the company tax rate of 25%. But the main feature of these structures are if you redeem the investment after a 10-year period, the proceeds are generally tax-free, so you won't pay any capital gains if you're redeeming after 10 years. So this structure can often be an effective way to achieve goals such as, let's say, saving for a child's education expense. If you have a young child and you want to send them to a particular high school, for example, these are the kind of structures that you might consider. So as I mentioned before, we've summarised the key considerations of each tax structure, being tax, cost, accessibility and flexibility. Now, a trade-off will ultimately occur whereby some compromises may need to be made. So the importance of each of these factors to an individual will obviously change over time. So for instance, an individual currently in their 20s or 30s may place less importance on tax effectiveness and value things like accessibility, lower costs, as well as flexibility when it comes to choosing a particular or a suitable tax structure. On the other hand, if you've got an individual who's, say, closer to retirement age, they may actually place a higher importance on tax effectiveness, and therefore they may opt to, for example, use super as their primary investment structure, given the tax effectiveness, and also because, given the restrictions on super, reduce once a condition of release is met and the super becomes accessible to them. So what's the most appropriate option for you? As I mentioned, will obviously depend on your own individual personal circumstances, including your taxable income, your age, your family situation, and your work intentions as well. So the next topic we'll be discussing, which can often be an overlooked one, is so when most people think about wealth accumulation and investing, they generally tend to think of things like super, shares, investment properties, etc. What can often be missed, and also is a crucial area to address, is to put an appropriate strategy in place for when things don't go to plan. So why do we need insurance? Now, without trying to be a bit of a buzzkill here, we've laid out on this slide some pretty sobering statistics. Now, of course, most of us are pretty confident that we'll never be one of these statistics. Especially here in Australia, it's pretty common for a lot of us to have the old she'll be right attitude when it comes to life and how we approach things. So insurance is one of those situations where you're spending money for the sole purpose of actually not wanting what the insurance company is offering, which is the right to claim. Nobody likes to pay for insurance. It's one of those necessary evils, or it's often a bit of a grudge purchase. It's not exciting like a new car or the latest iPhone or Android device. It's kind of just one of those things that you do when you reach a certain age and you have to kind of fend for yourself. Making a claim means, if you do need to claim an insurance policy, it means that you're now included in one of these statistics. Yet every Australian represented here probably didn't think that this could actually happen to them. So as the statistics show, 1 in 6 Australians will be dead before age 65. For those aged between 30 to 65, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of getting a significant illness. In 2018, there were 4.4 million Australians with a disability. And especially in Australia, there are over 10,000 house fires each year, and many of those homes that were burnt down are often underinsured as well. Now, if we relate this to being happy, healthy, and wealthy, insurance can often provide that safety blanket or peace of mind, knowing that upon a serious medical diagnosis or dealing with a natural disaster that's damaged or destroyed your family home, that you and your loved ones are financially protected. So what types of protections are deemed the most important to the average Australian? So we just saw the statistics relating to events that often create large financial losses. This graphic here shows the distribution of all Google searches across the various insurance product lines. So note that most people are more concerned about insuring their car or their holiday or even their pet over insuring themselves. So only 7% in total were searching for income protection or life insurance, which is probably the most important asset to both you and your family. 83% of Australians say they have insurance for their car, while only 31% actually go and insure their ability to earn an income via an income protection insurance policy. So to provide some context here, a 35-year-old earning $100,000 a year who works until the retirement age will earn a total of $3.2 million, and that's assuming no further pay rises as well. So isn't that worth protecting rather than, say, the average household car, which might be worth $20,000 or $30,000? So we've listed the important areas to consider when establishing an appropriate risk management plan. So firstly, we need to establish how much cover is needed and what you want to be covered for in the event of a particular insurance event. So for instance, would you want to have your debts repaid? Do you want to fund for children's education? Do you want to leave a lump sum behind for particular loved ones? From there, the next step is about understanding what the cost of the cover is. And thirdly, we need to then review the appropriate method of holding the insurance cover. So for example, with things like life insurance and disablement insurance, you can actually have the policy within super, or you could hold it outside of super. And also whether any particular features and benefits are required. So by features I mean things like an agreed value or a market value. And lastly, once a suitable insurance plan is in place, this should be reviewed on a regular basis. So one way to look at it is, as someone gets closer to retirement, and as they get older and build up their asset base over time, the amount of cover required generally should reduce. So your need for that insurance cover will also reduce, and therefore you should actually actively go and reduce the cover that you're insured for as a way of reducing the cost of the premiums as well. So on this slide, we've listed the main types of personal insurances that are available, and I'll cover what each of the insurance does and what future expenses someone might wish to insure themselves for. Now, one of the cornerstones of the super industry is the ability to set up insurances inside your super account, like I just mentioned before, with the exception of trauma cover. So the first one, death cover or life insurance, is generally used to do things like clear any debts owing, so if you have a mortgage or personal loans, pay for a funeral, and to provide a lump sum to cover things like ongoing living expenses for dependents and other costs such as future education expenses. Similar to life insurance, we've then got total and permanent disablement, or TPD for short, which is often used to do things like clear your debts, provide a lump sum for ongoing living expenses and dependents, as well as other costs such as education expenses again. In addition, TPD also provides funds to cover for, medical and rehabilitation expenses, and can also be used for areas such as renovations to your house. So the common example that I use is if you were paralysed and in a wheelchair for the rest of your life, you'll obviously need to make modifications to your house like ramps and grab rails in order to make it livable. So TPD can kind of provide for those expenses as well. The next one is income protection. Now, different to, life and TPD cover where they provide lump sums, income protection provides a monthly payment of up to 70% of your income if you're temporarily unable to work due to illness or injury. Now, in order to claim on income protection, there's a predetermined waiting period that you need to firstly meet before being eligible to apply. And also, once you're actually on claim, there's the benefit that you're being paid, that monthly benefit, is also paid for a predetermined amount of time, which is known as the benefit period. Lastly, with trauma insurance, so trauma insurance pays a lump sum to basically cover for medical and lifestyle expenses in the event that you suffer essentially a critical illness, so things like cancer, stroke, heart attack, etc. So when determining an appropriate amount of insurance cover, we need to firstly understand what your financial goals are, as this will impact on how much you need from an insurance perspective as well. So on this slide, we've listed the types of covers that can be held both inside and outside of superannuation. And we've also provided a summary of the tax deductibility of premiums. It's often not known, so for example, income protection premiums that you pay are actually tax deductible, which therefore reduces the overall cost, as well as whether the insurance benefits that are actually paid are taxable as well once you claim. Now, without going into too much detail, this slide hopefully demonstrates, I guess, the importance of considering the various tax implications of holding insurances either inside or outside of super when you're actually going about and putting together an appropriate insurance plan or risk management strategy. Now, estate planning is also a critical step in protecting your loved ones. Good estate planning ensures that your care and affairs are all in accordance with your wishes. Now, it's important to remember that your wishes will also change over time as your own personal circumstances change. And therefore, as and when you review the other areas such as your insurance, and as and when your financial situation changes, your estate planning needs should also be reviewed at the same time. Now, we've listed on this slide the key documents everyone should have prepared with regard to their estate plans. So firstly, you've got a power of attorney. Now, a power of attorney is a document which basically empowers a trusted person to act on behalf of another person with respect to the giver's finances, assets, or rights with respect to property. Now, under a limited power of attorney, the power is restricted in some way, such as time or to only perform certain acts. A power of attorney generally ceases to be effective when the giver loses mental capacity. An enduring power of attorney, however, is one that remains effective after the giver has actually lost mental capacity. So it remains in force until death, unless it's revoked whilst the giver has the mental capacity to actually revoke it. The third one on there, then, we've got an advanced healthcare directive. And so this is a document that states your wishes or directions regarding your future healthcare for various medical conditions. So it basically comes into effect only if you're unable to make your own decisions. Now, you might wish that your directive to apply at any point in time when you're unable to decide for yourself, or alternatively, you might only wish for it to apply if you become terminally ill. Now, most people are aware of what a will does. A will is a document that specifies what you'd like done with your assets in the event of your passing. So not having a will in place results in assets being, left in accordance to what we call interstate laws, which may not always follow people's wishes as well. And the last one up there is a binding death nomination. Now this relates to your super. So many people don't choose a beneficiary under the presumption that the funds will simply be forwarded to their estate for distribution. This can happen sometimes, but generally only if you've already nominated that option, so for your super to go to your estate. So we'll look at beneficiary nominations in a bit more detail in the next few slides as well. But firstly, covering off a bit more about the will. So basically this slide sets out what the will can and can't cover. So on the left-hand side, you can see what it can include. So your will covers, firstly, assets in your personal name. So things like your motor vehicles and your personal effects, any cash savings that are held in a bank account which are solely in your name, for example. And your will also covers assets that you own as a tenant in common. So an example of that is you might have an investment property which is owned under a tenancy in common arrangement with, let's say, a sibling. What your will can't include or doesn't cover. So your will doesn't cover any share of assets owned as a joint tenant. So for example, if you own a property with a spouse under a joint arrangement. Your will also doesn't cover any assets that are held in trust. So things like in a family trust, for example, or a discretionary trust. Your will can't cover any annuities that you're receiving, so regular payments of income or any regular compensation or support payments. And lastly, as I mentioned before, your will doesn't automatically cover your superannuation benefits unless you've specifically stated that you want your super to be paid to your legal personal representative. Now, going back to, I guess, super and the beneficiary nominations that you can make. So up here, this slide just illustrates, I guess, a few of the beneficiary nominations, the main two being what we call a non-binding nomination and a binding nomination. The differences between the two, a non-binding nomination, you can think of it like essentially a preferred nomination. So you're stating who you'd like your super to go to if you were to pass away, but the superannuation trustees aren't legally obliged to pay it out to who you've specified. They would not need to follow normal estate planning laws as to who's next of kin. Then you've got a binding nomination, and a binding nomination can be arranged under either a lapsing or a non-lapsing nomination. So a valid lapsing binding nomination remains in effect for 3 years from the date that it was first signed, last confirmed or amended. So every 3 years you need to renew that nomination. And it's a good way, I guess, to put things at the forefront and remind yourself to kind of update that as well. The non-lapsing binding nomination doesn't expire unless you actually go and amend it or revoke it. So it doesn't need to be confirmed every 3 years, and sometimes that can provide, I guess, added convenience. So super can be a pretty effective estate planning tool. Proceeds, as I said, it can be paid to the estate and therefore governed by the will if you'd like it to. Or alternatively, it sometimes can be useful in the sense that it can be paid directly to a financial dependent without having to pass through the estate. So sometimes the benefit of this is it can often speed up the process in often what's a difficult time. Now, with superannuation as well, it is important to note that the money can only go to someone who is a dependent under superannuation law, as well as if the trust deed allows it, or it can go to, as I said, your legal personal representative. Now, of course, when leaving your fund to an estate as well, if you do decide that to make things easier, you'd like to leave your super to your estate, obviously I can't emphasise enough that make sure that you have an up-to-date will in place. So again, to summarise some of the top tips for the sections we've just covered, firstly is check your insurance arrangements. What insurance cover do you already have in place? So I'm sure most of us in the room are probably going to have, let's say, car insurance and potentially private health cover. It's also a good idea to see what insurance coverage you might have within your own super funds, as often there's going to be some level of default or automatic coverage in place. Number two is to make a backup plan. So statistics show that sometimes the she'll be right attitude doesn't always get us by. So it's important to make sure that you've got a well-rounded risk management strategy for when the unexpected occurs. Thirdly, it's about identifying what's important to you. So everyone has different priorities, and these will have an influence when putting in place your own plan. Fourthly, I've said get your affairs in order with regard to an estate plan. So most people think that a will is something for old people. And look, it's never too early to put one in place, and the sooner the better. It's there to provide peace of mind, essentially. And lastly, don't forget to nominate your super beneficiaries. So because super isn't governed by the will, consider who you'd like to receive your benefits and put an appropriate nomination in place as well. So in summary, we've now covered off the topics of budgeting and debt management in the previous seminar if you attended that. And in this one, we've covered investment, insurance, and estate planning. Now, I hope you've all been able to take something away with you thus far, and I hope that the content has been, I guess, relevant and informative. The last seminar, which will take place next month, we'll be talking in a bit more detail about all things super. Now, the invitation to this seminar will be out within the next few weeks, so please feel free to register if you're interested in learning a bit more about super, and obviously I hope to see you again there. And now we've got some time for any questions if anyone has any. Yep.
Do you go back to that slide about what the will doesn't include, which assets?
Sure. Sorry. Yep. Did you have any particular question about anything up there? No? Okay.
Can you just maybe explain why the joint tenant asset is not included?
So the joint ownership will basically, if you pass away, that asset will automatically revert to the surviving owner. So if you basically, let's say the common example is a property. If you purchase it with a spouse, most people will put it as joint. And if you were to pass away, then that ownership fully becomes the spouse's. If you put it under a tenants in common arrangement, then you can actually will 50% or your share of that property to whoever you'd like it to.
So sorry to be morbid, but if both spouses pass away at the same time?
So generally, I guess it'll follow the estate planning laws in terms of next of kin. So you'll have to determine who that is, and you'll use the wills also, obviously as a guide to figure that out. Yep. It's a good question. I mean, it is actually asked probably a bit more often than you think. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep.
Sorry if I missed this, but can you actually explain what tenant in common means?
So a tenant in common means that you actually own a certain share of that asset. So let's say if there's two people, you can specify that I own 60% of this asset and this other person owns 40% of the asset. The reason why I guess you can do it that way is, one, sometimes it's beneficial from a tax perspective. If you have, let's say, a working and a non-working spouse, you might put more of the ownership in the non-working spouse's name, so you can direct more of the taxable income to them. Alternatively, if it's a negatively geared property, you might put it more to the working spouse because they can benefit from, I guess, the tax savings as well. And it's also, as I said, it's an estate planning thing. If you don't want that asset to automatically pass to the remaining owner, then you can essentially put it as tenants in common so that you can pass it on to who you want it to go to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm also wondering like how it's actually set up in the first place. Like how would you set up joint versus tenant in common?
It's just specified on the deed essentially when you actually
Purchase the house?
yeah. Yep.
Could you explain a bit more about the insurance bonds tax structure? Because I haven't actually heard of that one before.
Yep. So to just quickly go back. Yeah. So insurance bonds. Essentially, it's a trust structure which is which you can then choose to invest in, which earnings will only ever be taxed at the corporate tax rate, so 25% currently. And the way it works is essentially, so compared to your marginal tax rate when you're working, it's generally going to be lower than that, which is beneficial in that sense. As and when you eventually do want to redeem that particular investment, if you've held it for more than 10 years, you don't pay any capital gains tax on that particular investment. So it can be often useful. The example that I used for was funding children's education. So you might start to contribute to it when your kids are born, and then over time as they grow up, after that 10-year period, if you want to send them to a particular school, you might choose to redeem it, and it's tax-free in terms of being able to actually redeem it, rather than if it were held in your personal name, you'd simply pay tax at your marginal tax rates. Okay.
And the actual, I guess, asset that's purchased, are those purely bonds through that tax structure? Or?
No. So you can choose, I guess, from a selection of different investments. So you can choose, let's say, managed investments, which might invest in a portfolio of shares or a diversified portfolio. So different product providers will offer different investment options. Yep. You had a question?
Yeah, when investing in shares, sort of like index funds, is that kind of like a pretty good way to start in that sort of field, like long term?
Yeah, so I guess that comes back to the whole management style, because index funds are essentially what you call a passive investment style. So I guess the main benefit of index funds, sometimes when you're starting off investing, is generally they're going to be lower cost than more actively managed funds, and they essentially just track the index. So it'll go up and down over the long term. Generally, you'll see that the index will go up. It is a good way to essentially keep costs low. Yeah.
So I think Warren Buffett said to just always, every 6 months to a year, just keep buying, keep buying.
Yep.
Is that, I mean, it's worked out pretty well for him. So
Yeah, look, he'd probably know more than I do when it comes to that, so
Alright, so pretty
I'm not going to disagree with him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep, go ahead.
So there are some real lemons in the supermarket
Yep.
space. But why are there high performers and lemons? Like surely they are subject to the same laws, have basically the same objectives.
Yep.
So why can performance vary so much between products?
Yep, so look, it's a good question. I guess the regulator is starting to, weed out the lemons. You might have seen in, let's say, the news or whatever, they've started to essentially name and shame the really underperforming funds, and it's a way of them getting those funds to either lift their socks or exit the market by being, let's say, taken over by another super fund, which is becoming more and more of a common thing as well. It is a way that, I guess, like I said, the regulator is trying to improve those super funds. In terms of differences of performance, it's purely because the different super funds will choose how they want to invest the funds. So you'll have different investment managers as well. And sometimes it is also the difference between not wanting to spruik industry funds, but an industry fund versus a retail fund. A retail fund is, at the end of the day, it's a retail company that is there to make a profit and essentially reporting to shareholders. And so they might take, a cut of those profits to try and generate. It's not a wrong thing at the end of the day. They're there to make a business. Versus an industry fund, for example, which is essentially it's profit for members. So their sole purpose of trying to make a return is to return it back to its members. So sometimes therein lies the difference as well. And I guess the evidence is there when you do look at the top performing super funds, it's largely dominated by industry funds.
And sorry, by retail do you mean like Rest?
No, Rest is an industry fund. Rest is an industry fund which services any retail employees. By retail, I mean things like, I'm not trying to name and shame, but let's say, for example, top of my head, Colonial First State is a retail company which you may have heard of, which used to be owned by Commonwealth Bank. Yep.
So, I've got 3 questions. Do you want me to do all 3 at once?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. So the first one is the insurance bonds. What sort of companies would provide, sell that? Is it a bank or is it an insurance company? Where would you go to purchase
Yep.
an insurance bond?
You'll have different companies. So there will be like an insurance company that can provide an insurance bond. I don't know of any banks off the top of my head that do it nowadays, but there are other, investment companies. So similar to like Colonial First States, those kind of companies can sometimes provide insurance bonds. Off the top of my head, I can't name any product providers. Yeah.
And then with the slide with the 4 sort of things like EPA, will,
Yep.
binding death nomination, AHCG, where would you go to get an AHCG? Would it be a lawyer or would it be a doctor?
Normally, I say a solicitor can help you, draft one of those. Look, there are things like the powers of attorney, powers of guardianship, and wills. There are also the do-it-yourself kits, like you can go to the post office and buy a will kit or download a kit from the Justice WA website. Look, those are good if you don't really want to spend, but you want to put something in place. It's kind of like a fill in the blank. However, I always say, look, go and see a solicitor and pay the once-off fee and kind of get it done there, just to give you that peace of mind. But obviously, cost will factor into it as well.
So if you're a healthcare director, a lawyer would do it.
Yep.
And then with I think with super, you said, say you don't have children, with super you said if it's distributed through the super fund to the kids, you don't pay tax. But if you distribute to a non-dependent, you pay tax. I think is that what you said?
Yep.
So would it then make more sense if you weren't going to have children to then have your super go via the binding denomination to your estate, then that way you would avoid the tax
S-
that gets distributed.
So that one's a bit complicated in the sense that someone who is a beneficiary under superannuation legislation may not necessarily be a beneficiary under tax legislation. So, for example, an adult child is a beneficiary under super legislation, but are non-tax dependents. So, regardless, there would still be tax to pay upon, let's say, an adult child receiving a parent's superannuation funds. So it's not commonly known, but there are, I guess, tax implications, which, as part of our job as well, we sometimes look at, I guess, assisting people with trying to reduce that tax that inheritances may eventually pay. Yep, go ahead.
In terms of like investing on ETFs, what really is different? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
What's the difference between investing on some like CommSec or Vanguard? Like, what really is different between those?
So CommSec is the actual platform. So it's like the online broking platform. Something like the Vanguard is more investment manager. So they are the ones that actually, I guess, put out the managed funds. Whereas CommSec is like I said, it's a direct share platform that you can, yeah.
So how do you specify which tax structure you want to go with? Is that something that you set up at the start of the process, or is that something you've got to decide before you look into what investments you want to make?
Yeah, generally speaking, you'll consider your own circumstances first. Look, for majority of people who are, let's say, just started investing and earn a salary job, for example, generally speaking, keeping it simple, investing in your individual name is probably the easiest way to go about it, because things like trusts and company structures always add additional complexity in that there's setup fees, there's ongoing costs, there's accounting fees and all of that. But like I said, you would consider what your individual circumstances are first, and then from there, you're kind of using those different considerations, you then kind of select what structure is appropriate for you.
And okay, more generically, if you were to give, say, someone that's looking for like a longer term investment to say for a house, what type of structure or investment type would you recommend for, say, a beginner?
It depends. There's too many factors to be able to say, because it's not a one size fits all. It does depend on things like, one, your own risk profile, like what risks you're prepared to take, what you're comfortable with. As I mentioned before, it's about your time horizon as well. So, how long do you before you actually intend on purchasing a house? Because, as I said before, if you said to me, I want to purchase a house in 1 or 2 years, I'd probably say, look, when it comes to investing in shares, you want to be invested for at least a minimum 5 or so years. And so therefore, it's not to say that you can't go and invest in it, but it's just not an ideal time frame for you to be able to, I guess, invest. Because if in the short term we had a market crash, and in that 1 to 2 years, and then you needed to then redeem that investment to purchase a house, you're going to end up with less than what you initially invested in.
Just a quick one regarding the supers. So when you're trying to evaluate multiple supers, when you're switching a company or you're just trying to switch between a super, between a bank or not, there are hidden charges for super to incur, in a year. They charge you the admin fee, the expenses, and things like that. Apart from those charges, what are the things you see as a parameter for an individual to consider to select a super, considering they have, say, 30 years of their career or their preservation age? Obviously, they invest in different growth strategy, core strategy. What kind of things you would try to look at when you're selecting super? Because you generally go with what your employee gives you or what you're already with. Because you want to consolidate all super at once, things like that. So apart from those charges, what are the things you think?
Yeah, so the obvious ones are fees, and then the other obvious one is investment performance. Now, that big asterisk is you can't don't make decisions based on past returns. But in saying that, look, historical performance of a super fund is a good indicator of how the fund actually has been run, whilst it doesn't guarantee that it'll continue to perform. Then the other ones, I guess, would be things like, as I said before, any investment preferences. So if you, especially I guess with the younger generation as well, becoming more focused on ESG, sustainability, that kind of thing. If that's important to you, maybe seeking out a fund that I guess specialises in that. The other things would be insurance as well. If you are consolidating funds, make sure that your existing funds check the insurance covers that you have within them, because let's say, for example, if you have a pre-existing health condition and you go and cancel it, it's going to be hard to kind of get new insurances elsewhere as well. What I'd suggest, if you are looking at, I guess, comparing super funds, is use one of the independent research companies, companies like Chant West or Super Ratings, those kind of things, to be able to see who's a good super fund out there. And you'll generally see a common theme as to what super funds are good amongst that as well.
I mean, charges makes a lot of difference, doesn't it? The hidden charges.
Yeah, of course it does. Yep.
If I'm part of the fund, do I have a right to tell the fund what to do with my money? Like, am I like a shareholder?
Yes and no. So, I mean, there is the annual meeting, but essentially your voting right will be, one of millions of people, thousands of people in that fund. With most funds, most super funds generally invest in managed investments. So you don't, whilst you can choose, I guess, the level of risk and the type of asset classes that you invest in, you aren't actually able to choose the underlying investments within. So you can't select individual companies and that kind of thing. If you did want to do that, there are other products out there that can do that, but often they are, I guess, add to the cost as well. Yep.
Is UniSuper a retail super fund or an industry super fund?
It's an industry fund. So traditionally it was set up to, I guess, look after the retirement benefits of anyone employed by university or higher education research sector. It is now an open fund, which means, so as of July last year, anyone can join. And look, do the research yourself, but without giving it a shameless plug, it's a pretty good fund. So, yep.
I have two questions. What are some examples of asset classes?
Some examples.
Yeah.
So I'll just jump to the slide. So up here, so those are your common asset classes. So essentially cash and fixed interest. Fixed interest are basically things like bonds, and those are your defensive assets. They're low risk, but at the same time, they generally give you a lower return. And then you've got your property, shares. You've also got different asset classes like alternative investments, things like private equity or infrastructure, etc. Those are commonly known as your growth assets, and they'll go up and down. But over the long term, generally, they're going to outperform and give you the bulk of your return when compared to your defensive assets.
And what's the best way of maximising on compound interest based on your recommendation? Would that be in super or outside of super for someone who had low risk in a long period of time?
Again, it's hard to say because you need to kind of, I guess, factor in what your individual circumstances are. If it's, let's say, a long-term saving where you're happy to put it away and you're comfortable with, I guess, not being able to access those funds for the next 20, 30 years, then you might consider super because of its tax effectiveness. If it's something where you might need access to those funds in the short to medium term, you probably wouldn't be putting it into super because you're not going to be able to take it out again for quite a while. And that's kind of where I've said you need to really consider. I mean, you might then decide to do a balancing act and a bit of both. So, obviously focusing on retirement is important and you do need to save up for that. But at the same time, you probably need to make sure that you've got access to the funds in the short to medium term. So you might split up your savings into different areas as well. Yep.
Just the tax concessions within super you were talking about, and getting to retirement age of 60, and that might be give or take 30 years for most of us.
Yep.
Is there a view on how that might change in that 30-year time horizon now?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of asking how long's a piece of string. That is kind of the crystal ball question. My personal view is that over the years that the government's kind of tinkered with super and made different changes, look, some people are going to grumble and complain about some of the changes, but I personally think that they've, over time, made it more of a fairer system. Yes, they have taxed, I guess, the higher net worth individuals by putting caps on how much you can have in place in terms of a tax-free pension, but for the majority of people, it's not going to affect, you know, the everyday person. And I think that the government does try to, I mean, it's in the government's kind of best interest to try and make it a fair system, because that also reduces people's reliance on the government age pension as well. So it is, look, it's difficult to say, you know, that is the crystal ball question, but I do think what they've done over the years has tried to make it a more robust and fairer system. Yep. Any other questions at all? Yep.
If a spouse has super and they decide that they no longer going to work to look after children, what can you do with that super?
So there are, I mean, it's a good question. There are certain kind of contribution rules and concessions and things that you can do if it's a couple where, let's say, the working spouse is able to actually split their contributions and put it into the non-working spouse super, so you can kind of build it up at an even rate. And it is becoming more and more of a important consideration as well, because, as I mentioned before, there is now a cap in terms of how much you can have in terms of a tax-free pension when you retire. Previously to that, you know, it didn't really matter, and you didn't have to consider whose name the balance was in, but now it's becoming more of a relevant consideration. Okay. I think we've run out of time on that one, so we'll save any further questions. Look, I will just quickly do the legal thing that I have to do, and basically it's just obviously this presentation was general information only, and you can't take any of it as personal financial advice, because we haven't considered your situation. Lastly, there will be a feedback survey after this as well. So if you do have the time and if you wouldn't mind providing some feedback, it's also always helpful. It ensures that we're delivering relevant and meaningful content. And look, thanks everyone for taking time out of their evening to join tonight.